Here we are. This is our Thursday evening, Friday morning stream. I'm Matt Line, and got my coffee. I'm ready to do morning coffee, even though maybe evening for you. Now, first things first, let's make sure that this one is streaming to the appropriate name. So, as I promised that I would discuss President Franklin Pierce. Hello, Nicole. Nice to have you here. We'll wait for a few more people to show up, and then I'll begin discussing Franklin Pierce. I don't have too much to say on him, as he... What in the world is wrong with me? There we go. Our lovely, we now have multiple viewers. It's time for us to go into a little bit of something on Franklin Pierce. Now, the first thing to discuss, I think, would be his domestic policy. And then we could talk about his foreign policy. Now, in my opinion, Franklin Pierce's domestic policy had a problem. Now, it's been difficult for me to find too much. I gave myself half an hour to look at this, and I should have given myself more time in retrospect. But in the half an hour that I did give myself to look at this in order to properly answer Zayed's question, Franklin Pierce was a pro-slavery Northern Democrat. So obviously, having the pro-slavery bit kind of colors him in a bad light because, well, I believe in universal human rights. I believe in the right to liberty, and slavery is quite opposite that. So if you want to know my opinion with regard to his position on slavery, it's definitely opposed. And I would say that violations of life, of liberty, and of property, being able to defend against those would be within the realm of a larger governing body. I have many libertarian tendencies. I want the government to be as small as possible. But slavery is a no-go, and if people can't defend themselves, I would say that it's the job of the government to defend them against slavery, and therefore I am completely opposed to President Pierce on this position, or at least as he stood. Now, other things having to do with his presidency, leading up to his presidency, his only remaining son died in a train accident. So he wasn't exactly in the best frame of mind when he was appointing a cabinet or things of that nature. And so He filled his cabinet with extremists and didn't really think much of it. So clearly he wasn't thinking in terms of, okay, I want to have a second term as president. I'm just going to kind of do what I do and so on. So I'll read to you this particular piece from the Miller Center. The area comprising Kansas and Nebraska had been largely unsettled when Pierce took office, but there were plenty of settlers, entrepreneurs, and supporters of slavery and free soil poised to move in. The problem lay in the new territory's slavery status. Early legislation, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, banned slavery in the region, but Southerners wanted this overturned. In January 1854, Stephen Douglas, chairing a Senate committee that oversaw new states and territories, introduced legislation that established popular sovereignty. That is, letting local white citizens decide the slavery issue themselves. Douglas had personal reasons to settle the issue of slavery in the territories. He hoped that the newly proposed Transcontinental Railroad would adopt a northerly route through the West and would originate in Douglas's hometown of Chicago, thus ensuring his political clout and wealth. Pierce at first urged Douglas to leave the decision to the Supreme Court, which he believed would declare the various compromises that had banned slavery from territories unconstitutional. In this manner, the courts, and not the Congress or President, would be blamed by Northerners. Douglas refused, claiming that only a congressional repeal of the Missouri Compromise would keep the South in the Union. In a meeting with leading senators, including Jefferson Davis and Douglas, Pierce agreed under pressure to this explicit repeal of the prohibition against slavery in the territories north of the latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. After bitter debate, Congress passed Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act in May 1854, and Pierce signed it. This act was one of the most influential pieces of legislation in American history. In its wake, one party, the Whigs, was destroyed, while a new and strictly northern party, the Republicans, came into being, soon to be led by a lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, the Democrats were gravely weakened, especially Douglas and Pierce, as Northern Democrats split over the measure. Intended to lessen controversy, the act did the opposite, increasing national debates and tensions over slavery between North and South. So, ultimately, I think you can trace this back. Hey, Caleb, good to see you. Ultimately, I think you can trace this back to this idea of popular sovereignty. There is something about a Republican form of government that is considerably better to a democratic form of government. Now, you can have a democratic republic wherein the majority goes and decides things, aside from human rights, which are ubiquitous, which are universal. But that kind of a thing doesn't necessarily as the saying goes, and I love this saying, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Right? And so you can wind up having a group of people democratically choosing to oppress another. And I would say that is a wrong thing to do, period. And so, on account of him wishing to essentially push his policies through by hook and by crook. I mean, okay, we know the Supreme Court's going to likely vote this way, so we'll try to get it to them. But also, okay, we'll concede the popular sovereignty thing. And, well, having that particular democratic idea isn't necessarily the best way to go. That's all I'm going to say. I mean, people are enamored nowadays with democracy, but I'm not at all convinced that democracy without basic human rights is a good thing. I'm just not at all convinced. A constitutional democratic republic, sure, I can get behind that. A constitutional monarchy, I think I might be behind that more than I would a constitutional democracy, assuming that the power of the king would be limited. I mean, it's all a question of limiting the power of the government in the first place, which is something that pretty much everybody that's ever assumed the executive branch of the government hasn't tried to do. I mean, power is apparently a very addictive thing, and there aren't very many people that would assume power in order to give it away. So then you wound up having all sorts of difficulties on account of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and ultimately the situation in Kansas and the ongoing debate over slavery prevented Pierce from attending to other matters, although 19th century presidents considered themselves mere administrators. Still, for his failure to solve the slavery issue, the American public increasingly saw him as indecisive and ineffective. And that, of course, would be the indecisive thing being the whole willing to compromise bit. He compromised a bit more than he needed to. But the general basis of his principles I don't necessarily agree with. So that's a little bit about his domestic policy. Not too big of a fan. So Pierce, in terms of his foreign policy, wanted to annex Cuba. And, well, that didn't work out for him. That just didn't work out for him. His entire foreign policy was, well, considerably less involved than foreign policy is today. I mean, the U.S. wasn't as involved in geopolitical affairs throughout the world then as it is now. It was World War II, World War I, and World War II that wound up changing that. So the involvement of the U.S. in foreign affairs was dramatically less. But still, any involvement at that point was considered a pretty big deal, and so you kind of had to have your ducks in a line. But if you I'm just going to go and say, as a principle, one would expect that if you have particular land that you're in charge of, or that you're presiding over, essentially, if you're presiding over, if you're in the executive branch of the government, you would be expected to make decisions that are good on behalf of the country that you're in. Now, I'm not going to discuss the modern issues. Delving into the past, it's kind of difficult for me to get behind the idea that we should, without some form of getting involved in other countries' affairs is, for me, kind of a messy area, because I can see the benefits. I can certainly see the benefits, and I know what would happen if we don't. But there are perhaps better alternatives available. So I'm not too much for any president's foreign policy since, I don't know, George Washington. In terms of President Franklin Pierce as a person, he turned into an alcoholic. He died of cirrhosis of the liver. His wife convinced him for a time to join one of those, I'm trying to think of, what in the world do you call that movement? The thing where the bandwagon thing originally came from, when someone would stop drinking. I suppose I could just Google Franklin Pierce drinking problem. There we go. Franklin Pierce drinking problem. His wife, Jane Appleton, tried to get him to I can't even think of what it was called, but his wife tried to get him to not drink when he was would somebody please tell me? Would somebody please tell me what that movement was called? Puritan movement against drinking. Temperance movement. That was it. The temperance movement. And temperance meant, in that particular case, no drinking whatsoever. So his wife tried to convince him to become part of the temperance movement. He apparently did for a time, and then he wound up drinking himself into the grave after his life went to crap. So overall, I would consider his life not something that I would want to emulate. In fact, I'd say it'd be pretty abysmal to be President Franklin Pierce. So I hope that would answer your question. Hello, Jack. Good to see you. We just finished talking about President Pierce, and I wound up getting a pretty inarticulate mess. But now it's about time to jump into the Iliad. This is going to be a short stream. It's going to be a total of about 45 minutes, or a little less. Plan on streaming for another 15-20 minutes before breaking to do the parlor with Caleb. So we'll begin with the Iliad, Book 4, line 332. Them also pleased the king of men beheld, and in winged ascents hailed them as he passed. Brave leaders of the mail-clad host of Greece, I move not you to duty, ye yourselves. Move others, and no lesson need from me. Jove, Pallas, and Apollo were but all, courageous as yourselves, soon Priam's towers should totter, and his Ilium stormed and sacked, by our victorious bands stooped to the dust. He seized, and still proceeding next arrived, where stood the Pylian orator, his band, marshalling under all their leaders bold, Alastor, Chromius, Pelagon the vast, Hemon the prince, and yes, martial chief. Chariot and horse he stationed in the front, his numerous infantry a strong reserve, right valiant in the rear the worst, and those in whom he trusted least he drove between, that such through mere necessity might act. First to his charioteers he gave in charge their duty, bade them rein their horses hard, shunning confusion, let no warrior vain, and overweening of his strength or skill, start from his rank to dare the fight alone, or fall behind it, weakening when he leaves. And if dismounted from his own he climb, Another's chariot let him not affect. Perverse the reins, but let him stand his spear, advancing firm, far better so employed. Such was the discipline in ancient times of our forefathers. By these rules they fought, successful, and laid many a city low. So counseled them the venerable chief. Long time expert in arms he also saw King Agamemnon with delight, and said, Old chief, ah, how I wish that thy firm heart were but supported by as firm a knee. But time unhinges all. Oh, that some youth had thine old age, and thou wast young again. To whom the valiant Nestor thus replied, Atrides, I could also ardent wish that I were now robust as when I struck brave Berthalion breathless to the ground. But never all their gifts the gods confer on man at once. If I then had the force of youth, I suffer now the effects of age. Yet ancient as I am, I will be seen, still mingling with the charioteers, still prompt to give them counsel, for to counsel youth is the old warrior's province. Let the green in years, my juniors, unimpaired by time, push with the lance, for they have strength to boast. It's actually a very interesting bit. We'll end with line 383 and have a little bit of a discussion about the sentiment expressed by Nestor. But never all their gifts the gods confer on man at once. So there's this general idea that you can't have everything. And I suppose, in the sense of you can't have youth and old age at the same time, that would kind of make sense. But if you say that you can't have youth and wisdom at the same time, I would say that'd be a pretty foolish thing to say, because you can't. It's just a question of taking a big picture look at things and understanding cause and effect on a grand scale, in addition to in the day-to-day little matters. So, I don't know. But I do know that that's a common thing to be believing and to be thinking. It's a common idea that you can't have everything. That's why people that are both beautiful and intelligent have so many problems. You know, it's more difficult for beautiful, smart women, at least from all the ones that I've talked to be able to find an appropriate life partner or even a date. Because beautiful, intelligent women are scorned by many other women unless they go completely out of their way to be as sociable as possible. And so, and because you can't exactly deny beauty, their intelligence is scorned. Their intelligence is looked at as stupidity. Oh, she can't actually be smart. And so you wind up having many beautiful, intelligent women succumbing to this nasty inferiority complex because they've been told their whole life that you're not as smart as you are. You're stupid. Well, you won't necessarily believe that because you understand your own capacity, but you wouldn't necessarily think as well of yourself as you as might behoove you. So then it's the same thing. Like in terms of guys, how could somebody be both fit and smart, or both socially capable and smart? If someone is smart, the general idea is, oh well, he must have some glaring deficiency in some other aspect of his life that's going to prevent him from, being whole in a certain way. I mean, some people lack intelligence, right? But they got that, they got their hard work, they got their charisma, all the rest of that stuff. But then if you have intelligence, well, you can't have all the gifts. I mean, it's stupid, because there do exist people that have the whole package. Now, granted, I don't. I kind of gave up my height on account of, my height and a great deal of my health for a great period of time went away. I didn't have what it took to deal with stress. But there are plenty of people that have it all. And interestingly, a lot of them that I know are driven to depression and to alcoholism and so on because, well, people resent them. That's why, in general, in society, unless you can find a way of somewhat extricating yourself, I would contend that it's best not to show off your abilities. Or at least to kind of let them come as a surprise to people. But do let them speak for themselves when they do, when the occasion actually does come to show it. Like when you're well, let's go back to the Iliad example. You have good counsel, you have good judgment, you have the ability to make good decisions. And for most people, that goes up with time, which is a good thing, because when it goes up with time and yet the strength of limb goes down, you move an awful lot of the doing from the muscles to up here. And certainly that can help as people learn and grow. But saying that there aren't people that had it all to begin with is just hogwash. It's a lie. I know plenty of people that do. I'm not going to just go here and name them on stream. But I'm sure that if you go and take a look in your life, you're going to find those kinds of people too. It's just a fact of life. We have a varied population. There's lots of variance in many different aspects of the population. And that's just a consequence of who we are. I mean, we wind up having a diverse genetic structure, we wind up having diverse environments, and so on. And so one would expect there to be diversity. And if there's diversity amongst many aspects of life or traits that a person can have, it only seems fitting that there would be some that are lacking everything and some that have everything. Just by nature of things being a normal distribution, one would kind of expect that. And then, if we're going to talk about things from the evolutionary biological perspective, the people that have one trait might interbreed with people that have another trait. And then over time, you wind up having people that go and amass all these different traits. And then wind up being even more removed. I mean, it's not even necessarily regression to the mean at that point, because if you wind up collecting all of the good traits and then having all the people with good traits, attracting people with good traits, that could result in there being a new mean to regress to. So there's an awful lot to consider here. That's a lot more complicated, but that's just the particular saying is just but never all their gifts the gods confer on man at once. If then I had the force of youth, I suffer now the effects of age. Yet, ancient as I am, I will be seen still mingling with the charioteers, still prompt to give them counsel, for to counsel youth is the old warrior's province. Let the green, in years, my juniors, unimpaired by time, push with the lance, for they have strength to boast. And we know how to keep your strength into old age. It's just, but still, if you wind up having, say for example, people with a Spartan lifestyle, and I mean the actual lifestyle of the Spartans, which is basically you're trained to go to war, and you're either coming home carrying your shield or on your shield as a gurney, basically as a body carrier. And so that kind of forces you throughout your years to either remain on top of things or you're called. You're called from the gene pool, C-U-L-L-E-D. I don't know, just a few thoughts. Yes, sorry. The part where I talked about Franklin Pierce was at the beginning. If you want to watch it, from the beginning after the stream's done, we're going to be done here in about 6 to 11 minutes or so. I didn't have too much to say. I'll give you a little bit of a recap. Franklin Pierce wasn't the kind of person I would like to be. His domestic policy was completely overshadowed by one issue. That would be the abolitionist slavery thing. And he shot himself in the foot there. Not to mention the fact that I think he came down on the wrong side of this right to liberty thing. And his foreign policy was considerably less involved than present-day foreign policy. And altogether pretty unsuccessful, given that he didn't accomplish much of what he set out to do. His primary goal, the annexation of Cuba, failed. So, then being a drunk with a tragic life, even having jumped on the temperance bandwagon for a while, didn't really help him. He died an unhappy wreck of cirrhosis of the liver, so he drank himself into the grave. That, to me, doesn't sound like much of a good life. That's the 2-minute recap of 15 or so minutes of just plain old rambling. And we'll finish discussing this whole bit about never all their gifts that God confer on man at once. I suppose if we're being pedantic and slicing and cutting hairs, that is a true statement, and I'll concede that. But the sentiment of the statement seems more to be this general idea of you can't have it all. Which, the more I think about it, the more it might be expedient to actually pay lip service to. It might be expedient. And that's actually probably one of the reasons that I'll give you an example. There are especially where I live, wealth or conspicuous wealth is not viewed as a good thing. People here are horribly, horribly envious. People have this social welfare system here, not because they actually care for the poor, but rather because they hate the rich. And so redistributionist policies are constantly such that people are trying to take away the resources of the rich, and the rich are constantly trying to stay a step ahead of everybody else, and manage to do pretty well because the politicians essentially put in policies that allow them to remain rich, and then the rich people can just take advantage of the legal loopholes that are in place, while the people still feel like somehow they're sticking it to the man through fiscal policy. If you're interested, you can read some George Orwell, where he describes that particular phenomenon of people who are socialists. Not being socialist because they care for the working class, but rather being socialist because they hate the rich. And so these sorts of sayings are very good at deflecting hatred. These sorts of sayings are very good at deflecting these sorts of problems. And whereas I would rather live in a world where these problems wouldn't be an issue, where people's envy wouldn't result in scheming and wouldn't result in all these different kinds of interpersonal problems. I'm realistic, and at least in my own life, am eschewing the idea of keeping up with the Joneses and of conspicuous consumption and the like, in order that I don't alienate people to begin with. You know, it's a lot easier to live beneath your means than to live above them. And whereas I completely understand that for wealthy people, living beneath their means could oftentimes mean a lifestyle of very conspicuous and lavish consumption, and I wouldn't myself be against that at all. I would just highly caution them to be prepared to deal with the consequences of their actions, if that is something they choose to do. So that's about all I have for this time. I look forward to seeing you then on Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope you guys have a good rest of the night, morning, day, whatever it happens to be, and we'll talk to you later.